Something we've heard a lot of in the last few months is responsibility. Who's responsible for what? Who's responsible for the virus? Who's responsible for doing something about the virus? Who's to blame? All these words, who's responsible for helping the people who are suffering because of the economic crisis? Responsibility and blame. Two things that often get confused with one another. What is responsibility? When should we take responsibility? How do we learn to become more responsible? Of course, perhaps the key difference between blame and responsibility is that blame is about getting the solution or the problem away from yourself. Responsibility is an act of empowerment where it says, I'll take charge, or I'll take ownership, or I'll do something about it. Whereas blame shifts it away from ourselves, and it literally diverts attention from ourselves or any role we may have either in the problem at hand or doing something about it. And actually, blaming ends up shifting control over our own lives and responsibility for our own lives to another source. People frequently blame someone else or the government or something that actually happened, and in many ways, by shifting control away from ourselves, we're likely to increase the problem for ourselves and perhaps put ourselves in a weaker position. Certainly, one thing that blame is very capable of is causing pain in other people. Blame means we're holding them responsible for something that is hurtful or that has caused pain to ourselves. So blame is a way of diverting the pain away from ourselves, diverting the power to do anything about that, and putting it into other hands. The tendency to blame is not only a lack of taking responsibility, but it's also driven by this inability we feel to see a way out or to see a better outcome or how this might be in an outcome, which is not in itself a problem, but our own response to that, because we end up feeling inferior or as if there must be something wrong with me because I can't see a way out of this problem, it then becomes easier to blame someone else and say, I didn't create this problem, therefore I'm not supposed to do anything about it, and therefore I'm not at fault when nothing is done about it. Often our inability to find our way out of a difficult situation is because if we admit that we can't find our way out of that situation, we are admitting some kind of weakness in ourselves. I'm literally saying I have an inability to do something. So helplessness, victimhood, and self-righteousness all connect together. I'm helpless, it wasn't me. I'm a victim, it is being done to me. And therefore I deserve, or someone else must fix. I deserve some recompense, or someone else must fix. All which are really a way of avoiding our own shortcoming, or our own perceived shortcoming. Admitting that we don't know what to do about it feels like the weakness. So therefore, blame seems like the solution. And we excuse our own problems by saying it's another person's wrongdoing that is causing me to suffer this way. When a person is frightened by the circumstances or by the events or by other people or whatever, because they feel powerless, they restructure that feeling into being not responsible. Because to say I have no power is a negative way of describing yourself. If you find a way to transform that into saying I am not responsible for that, then it's not anything bad about yourself that you're saying. You say, well, it's nothing to do with me really. And so you don't have to cast yourself in a negative light. The psychologist Robert Burrows, who specializes in looking at how fear and violence are related to one another, reckons that we essentially unconsciously fool ourselves into abdicating responsibility as a way of not owning our powerlessness. And it's especially true, he says, when the problem is not close to us. It's easy to say, it's over there, it's not my problem. And this is something that we've easily seen in situations like the lockdown, where there are people in other communities who are suffering and struggling, who are starving, all of those negative consequences that are geographically far enough removed from us for us to be able to say, it's not my problem. It's even to the point of being able to say everything is actually okay. But of course, it's easy to persuade yourself that if it's far away from you, it isn't your responsibility to do something about it. What about the people over there? What about their own people? Why isn't their family doing something about it? Why isn't their political representative doing something about it? It's not my responsibility to do something about it. So that isn't really so much about responsibility as about fear and disempowerment and not wanting to feel that powerlessness out of not doing anything about it. So Burroughs gives an example of how we might deal with someone we encounter in the street who is homeless or begging. And, initially, it's actually a certain kind of fear that we feel. It's a fear that we're supposed to do something about it and we're not doing anything about it. And so we end up feeling guilty. So we see someone who's begging, we feel a certain amount of guilt because we have what we need. We have clothes, we have food, whatever. So we feel guilt and a certain amount of fear because I guess that could be us, or perhaps it triggers some sense of powerlessness in us, or when we're not able to do something about it. But then that often will transform itself into a type of anger or of shifting the blame. So we might end up saying, why isn't that person doing something for themselves? Why aren't they going to a shelter? They're the ones who ran away from their family, or, and any number of things. Why are they drinking? If they're suffering so much, I'm not going to give them any money because all they're going to do is go and spend it on a bottle of booze. Very common reaction, that. And that is just another way of shifting any sense of responsibility for doing something about it. If I did something about it, it's going to get wasted on a bottle of booze. So therefore I don't have to do anything about it. They're all just ways of not being responsible and dealing with the feelings of guilt in this particular example that come along with that, and at worst, anger. So we often look down on homeless people or on beggars or at people, on poor people, as somehow lesser or inferior, or very commonly they got themselves into that situation. Again, another way of not taking responsibility. Burroughs, being a psychologist, reckons that it's a kind of an unconscious anger that they might feel because earlier in life as a child they never received help that they needed. I'm not sure if everything comes from something like that, but certainly that might be one way that those type of situations arise. But bottom line is, by framing the person's situation as a consequence of their own actions, we don't have to be responsible for doing anything about it. And by framing their behavior, saying they're going to spend it on alcohol or whatever the case may be, we don't have to do anything about it. He gives other pointed examples of how we tend to behave in a situation like that. One example that he gives, which I think people also identify with, is when we feel seemingly genuine regret that I wish there was more that I could do. And since I can't really do anything significant, what's the point? If I give them $5 now, what's the point really? Because it's not significant and they're just going to spend it, even if they spent it on food, in 5 minutes, and it's not significant help. And that pre-definition of what the significant help is becomes a way of not taking responsibility. I'm not helping at all because I can't help enough. And it sounds to our own brains like that's a positive reason to be not helping. Where of course it was just an evasion. Their fear enables them to avoid what they might have done. The $5 would have been something, or they might have been able to do something else, but they block it immediately by saying, there's no point in doing anything because I can't do it enough. Or the more challenging version as well, another thing that many of us might recognize is when we say that, well, this person doesn't contribute in any way, and the results, where they are, is a result of their own actions in some way. Very commonly, when a wealthier person looks at a person in need on the street like that, and particularly if that wealthy person wasn't even born into that wealth and they earned it the hard way, then they're easily able to say, I worked to get here, I suffered to get here, I worked 18 hours a day, and here I am, and I did it for myself. And therefore, I don't have to help you because no one helped me. I can feel sorry for you, but I don't have to help you because no one helped me. I don't have to take any responsibility for you because no one took responsibility for me. And it just becomes a diversion and again, a way of not addressing the sense of powerlessness and guilt that we might feel within ourselves. As Burroughs points out, anyway, even that has certain prejudices within it. I worked very hard to get here. You should be working just as hard. Doesn't address the massive economic and social inequalities that put people in a situation like that. That someone in a particular social group or social situation might work 8 hours and get 50,000 at the end of the month. And another person, more often, might work 12 hours and get 5,000 at the end of the month. And it doesn't address that. It doesn't address the massive social inequalities that also create that difference between them, which the guilty, the one who's feeling guilty, doesn't recognize and says, if I worked this hard to get this money, so could you. In an ideal world, but that's not the world we're living in. So it becomes a way of avoiding any sense of responsibility for the greater. Something I'll get back to in a minute, but the one other thing that is also worth a mention that Burroughs touches on, that also causes people to evade responsibility, is the instead focusing on the positive as a way of really not dealing with the negative at all. So it's essentially a form of self-delusion. So it might be, here's someone who's talking about, oh, well, at least they've got somewhere to live. Or, they can at least always go to the shelter in town and then they're going to be fine. Or, well, you're positive, you've got a strong heart, and that you greet everyone every morning, and that positive attitude's really going to get you somewhere. And he says it is just an evasion of responsibility, especially when then the shelter in town, where you say, but the government will handle it. The government must be responsible for this. So he takes it much further finally, and I want to quote directly from Burroughs. The most widespread ways of evading responsibility are to deny any responsibility for military violence while paying the taxes to finance it, denying any responsibility for adverse environmental and climate impacts while making no effort to reduce consumption, denying responsibility for the exploitation of other people while buying the cheap products produced by their exploited and sometimes slave labor. Denying any responsibility for the exploitation of animals, despite eating and otherwise consuming a range of animal products. And denying any part in inflicting violence, especially on children, without understanding the many forms that this violence can take. That is a very profound statement. Ultimately, we evade responsibility by ignoring the existence of the problem in the first place. So, in a world of blame, we often miss that point. We often push it always towards other people. There's the good people, the bad people, all of those kind of things, and someone else is to blame. So the real challenge is to ask yourself, where do I evade responsibility, and where can I take responsibility in the future? The most important place is to start with our own lives, to try and accept total responsibility for every aspect of our own lives. And once we do that, we open ourselves to much greater possibilities. As long as we stop blaming others, we take back power in our own lives. Whereas if we're always blaming our parents or our spouses or the government, we'll never be at peace, because they're always doing something. So as long as the location of responsibility is outside of ourselves, we're always unhappy. So responsibility requires us to move from this blame of the others to empowering ourselves. It's an empowerment. Blaming amplifies the anger and the feeling of victimhood, the feeling of powerlessness, and the feeling of unhappiness. Taking responsibility brings that power back to us. When we see ourselves as a victim, we are locked into an identity that is rigid and powerful and unfortunately self-reinforcing, because it's got a self-righteousness to it. I deserve to be compensated, I need sympathy, I'm the victim, I'm not responsible. It doesn't mean that you should take responsibility for things that are done to you that you did not do yourself, but you can take responsibility for how you respond to that, what you do about that. So, because when we distance ourselves from our own role in our own problems, we remove the possibility that we're the one who could do anything about it. So when we recognize I might not be the originator of this action, but as the recipient of it, victim of it, I'm now in the position of being able to respond how I want to respond. And we need to find ways that are more powerful. Some people say, certainly it's worth for some of them thinking about what part did I play in how this came to me. It's not true for everything, but sometimes it's a way of just getting the focus back to yourself for some things. It doesn't mean you're a sucker, it doesn't mean you're to blame, it just means how can I claim responsibility for my own life so that I feel empowered to do something about it. And of course, taking responsibility and letting go of blame doesn't mean that the other person is faultless if they've done something to you. It doesn't mean you've automatically forgiven them. Forgiveness is an altogether different issue. But by taking the responsibility for your own actions and your own responses back to yourself, you're able to move forward and not get stuck in that victim situation. Literally, you free yourself. This idea of what are we in control of is often referred to as the locus of control. And the locus of control is when we believe we're in charge of our own lives, we have an internal locus of control. And when we feel that other things are responsible for what's happening to us, or other people are responsible for what's happening to us, then we feel that we have an external locus of control. And that also is what can lead to victimhood. What is really interesting is that research shows that in 2002, the average young person was more externally focused and located the source of control outside of themselves than some 40 years earlier. People tested in the 1960s, 80% of young people doing the survey in the 1960s located the locus of control in their lives inside themselves. The same 80% of people in 2002 located it outside of themselves. The more in those surveys, the more strongly that people believed that they could change things in their lives, the more likely they were to take responsibility for what happened in their lives, including what went wrong, and the more likely they were to try fix those mistakes that they made and that went wrong in their lives. And then they end up fundamentally changing who they see themselves as. So sometimes responsibility is simply related to acknowledging I did wrong, because that means I can fix that. Acknowledging I'm not perfect or acknowledging I made a mistake ends up as being an extremely empowering act, because they identify themselves as a powerful person. It begins to change the idea of who they are as a person. It begins to change the idea of, well, this is who I am and there's nothing I can do about it. If there are things we don't like about ourselves, there certainly those can be shifted by acting in a way that brings responsibility and power more back to us in the situations where we feel disempowered and others to blame and so on. And that sense, it's almost like immediate direct evidence, proves to you that you're much more in charge of your own life than you thought, and enables you to make changes that you might have thought you could never make. John Izzo, another psychologist, defines people who are responsible as the owners. They own their lives. He says that as opposed to the renters, they're the owners. They own their lives. They're loyal. They're responsive. They're volunteers. They're diligent. They're loyal. They're reliable. They're good in teamwork, but they're good at taking the initiative. They're good at committing themselves. They're good at making sacrifices, interestingly. And basically, they are the people who are conscientious and follow through, who are accountable and committed. So they act in a way that is self-empowering and frequently empowering of others. So Izzo and others give a number of recommendations on how to strengthen the sense of responsibility in yourself. The first thing is, of course, to catch yourself when you think like a victim, and to realize, I'm thinking like locus of control is outside of me. Let me move the locus of control back to me. So then ask yourself the question, what could I do? And he says, focus on adapting or changing as the answer. So always try and find that. Don't look for who's responsible. Assume you're responsible. Look for, how can I change? How can I adapt? What do I need to do? He even says, catch other people saying, when people say things won't change, challenge that. Or when you have your inner voice that says, there's nothing I can do, he says, use that as a motivator to do something. Doesn't matter what it is. Just take a step. You also need to have a certain amount of strength and grit. When you hit a wall, ask yourself, what is another way I could do this? Another way to make it easier, he says, is don't get into situations where you're overwhelmed and then it feels like you can't do anything. So one of the things you can do to increase your responsibility or your capacity to act that way is to narrow things. Find one thing you can change, not everything you can change. In the situation, find the one thing that you can do or that will respond to any kind of a change. That is incredibly empowering, because in many situations there is at least one thing that can be done, or one little angle you can get. And he says that's the way to do it. Don't allow yourself to believe there's nothing you can do because there's too much to do. And most importantly of all, speak up. Speaking up is a form of stepping up, he says. So instead of being helpless and moving along, say, let's do something about this. Either I will do something about it, or I'll find someone who will work with me, who will do something about it. Izo says that failure to speak up is one of the things that holds us back the most. He says one of the most important reasons to step up is that most of the time we regret not stepping up. As has been said by many people, when you look back on your life, you're much more likely to regret the things that you didn't do than the things that you did do. Think about that. Take responsibility, never have regrets. Perhaps changing the world could be easier than we think. I'll see you again next week, same time.